tell you something about the history of St. Bernard from 1817 until the end of the Civil War. I think Parish wanted us to really focus on 1817 because it was in that year, by an act of the state legislature, that St. Bernard Parish expanded north and westward along the Mississippi River. From 1780 until 1810, St. Bernard Parish, and then the Población de San Bernardo, before it was St. Bernard Parish, extended from just the rear of what was Poydras Plantation to, and I quote, the lakes that empty into the sea. But that was the description, and that's where the Isleños first settled. In 1811 and 12, the boundary of St. Bernard was pushed west to include Poydras Plantation, and then it reached the river. But then in 1817, the boundary extended from Poydras, what is today Violet, all the way to the Canal des Pêcheurs, Fisherman's Canal in Arabic. And Fisherman's Canal ran more or less along the site of Aycock Street in Arabic today. So it was in that year that the extent of St. Bernard really changed radically. And from that time on, there was the riverfront in St. Bernard, and then that part of the original parish, which was called the interior. So where we are right now is the historic interior. And of course, in 1817, what kind of parish were we looking at now? 2 years after the British invasion of Louisiana and St. Bernard Parish, 2 years after the evacuation of the British destroyed St. Bernard Parish, and so did the Americans. And they really had no choice, particularly the Americans. But the British destroyed the parish, and as they withdrew down here, they took all of the fencing, all of the outbuildings like barns, chicken coops. They left the houses for the families to live in. And then Jackson kept the militia mustered through March, because of course, you know, in those days, you didn't have internet. There was no Facebook for the federal authorities to announce that the British had lost the Battle of the Orleans. And there was no Facebook or internet to announce anything. So Jackson was deathly concerned that the British would come back, and as a matter of fact, they did try in January to take Fort St. Philip downriver from here. And of course, that effort also failed after the Battle of New Orleans, January 8th. So anyway, the parish was just laid into a ruin. And you know, I think it's really interesting when you look at the history of any community. I don't believe that disasters, natural disasters or disasters, define a community except when the community dies as a result. But these disasters are always benchmarks, and they contribute to the evolution of a community's identity. And so that's exactly what happened here in St. Bernard Parish in 1815, 16, 17, into the early 1820s. The sugar plantations along the Mississippi River were absolutely destroyed. The Chalmette family lost their plantation. It was sold because different creditors, including Chalmette's half-brother, Pierre Denis de Laron, had to foreclose. And so the Chalmette plantation was subdivided. The Bienvenue plantation, which was where Kaiser Aluminum is today, next to Chalmette, that plantation also was sold. The Bienvenues liquidated everything there, and then it was at that point that some of the bienvenus went out to southwest Louisiana, and that's why there's a large contingent of the same family out there. Though there were some who remained here and ultimately established themselves about 3 miles down the bayou from here at a place we now call Kenilworth. But in any event, as these plantations along the river were sold, they actually became of interest to real estate developers. And for example, Chalmette Battlefield and Bienvenue Plantation, Chalmette Bienvenue Plantations, those plantations were subdivided and they were called battleground estates. Oh yeah, and they were subdivided into 1 arpent tracts fronting the Mississippi River. An arpent is a French unit of measure, about 196 English feet, and that varies, 192 French feet. So an arpent along the river by 80 arpents of depth, so almost 3 miles. And so there were these long slivers along the river. And you'll never guess that though the Bienvenue Plantation and the Chalmette Plantation were both purchased by Hilaire and Michel de Saint-Amand. And they were free people of color. And they are the ones who subdivided those 2 plantations. Then Pierre Denis Laurent was always a very frugal man. He was well beloved by the Spanish people who were here. He helped to establish the Isleños in their houses. And then he was the colonel commanding the 3rd Regiment of Louisiana Militia in which they fought. And he wrote a wonderful letter in the newspaper and other wonderful pieces wherein he extolled the courage and the commitment of the Canary Island people to Louisiana. So he was able to regain his fortune, and when he died in 1824, he was immensely wealthy. And his house, we see the ruins of it today in the median of St. Bernard Highway, his house was probably the most elegant, the most beautifully appointed home in St. Bernard Parish. It had mahogany furniture. It had hand-painted wallpaper. It had beautiful Sèvres porcelain. It had beautiful silver portraits. As a matter of fact, there was a wonderful Salazar portrait of Pierre Denis Laurent when he entered the Spanish militia. And it survived the British, but unfortunately it couldn't survive my family. Emile Ducrot, who was his great-great-grandson, one night got drunk and decided he would burn the painting, and he did. But happily, Robert Glenk, who was the first director of the Louisiana State Museum, had gotten to my cousin, and so they made not a Xerox, but a photostatic copy of the painting, and so that's still in the collection there at the museum, State Museum. But of course it's black and white. But in any event, one of the great houses in St. Bernard was that of Pierre Denis Laurent. His widow died in 1832. She was Eulalie Gerbois. And then the plantation was sold later that year. And it became De La Ronde Plantation, Versailles Subdivision. So you see, De La Ronde never called it Versailles. And I can remember one time speaking to one of the old Ducrot, and he said, why, of course he would never have named that place Versailles. De La Ronde was better than that. But anyway, it was named Versailles by the developer, who was Daniel Warburg. Daniel Warburg was an Ashkenazi Jew. He was from Prussia, from a family of great bankers. I think we have someone here in this room who knows some German history and will recognize that name. And in any event, he is the one who subdivided the plantation, and he did it twice. In 1836 was the original subdivision with the chemin de Paris Road, not Parish Road, but Paris Road. And then there were long lots that faced each side of the chemin de Paris. Well, then something called the Panic of 1837 happened, which was the 19th century equivalent to 1929. And as a result, Warburg came back and he had Alu Demecoeur re-subdivide his subdivision. And that's when the street grid that we recognize today was established, with the names Montesquieu, Fenelon. Genius Street is actually Genieux for a genius. And there are other, Saint-David was the name of one of the sons-in-law of Chalmette. And Morales, that was a name that came from the Orleans, from the new Faubourg Marie. And Morales was named for Juan Buenaventura Morales, who was the last Spanish intendant of Louisiana. And so it's very interesting, all the street names that are still there that are perpetuated in St. Bernard, but which have been lost in the city of New Orleans. And so really, when we look at the subdivision of Chalmette into a more modern urban scape, it really traces back to Daniel Warburg and his opening of the Versailles subdivision. As we come down the river, the next big plantation was the plantation of Pierre Lacoste. Lacoste held on to his plantation much longer than Chalmette and Bienvenue, but he was very much in debt. His house was where the cafeteria is today of Chalmette High School. And it stood, some of you might remember it, it stood into the 1960s. It was very much in a ruined condition behind the water plant. And just to give you some idea, you would think, why in the world would a plantation house be built where the Chalmette High School is? Well, there's a reason for that. In 1816, 1815, the river levee was along Ohio Street. Have you ever wondered why Ohio Street has that strange configuration? It's because it's running along the course of the 1815-16 levee. And the river has built out that much on the east bank since 1815. And that's why this is a Battue bank. The west bank is the Banque d'Écart, the cliff bank, the bank that collapses. So all of those houses that were on the west bank and all of those sugar plantations, sugar houses, all of that collapsed in the river. Yeah. So anyway, it's very interesting. Now with Lacoste, he entered into 10 different mortgages. Oh, wow. With one person. The person was Eulalie Mondeville. Now you wonder, Eulalie Mondeville, doesn't that sound like a familiar name? Eulalie Mondeville's father gave the land to the King of Spain to establish St. Bernard Parish. His name was Pierre-Philippe de Marie, and she was Bernard de Marie's half-sister. And she was a great businesswoman. She had tremendous business acumen. And so she wound up foreclosing on Pierre Lacoste and forcing him off the estate. And then she also subdivided the Lacoste plantation. Now as we go below Lacoste, the next plantation was Villeray, the Villeray plantation. And Jacques-Philippe Villeray did very well. He was able to recuperate rather quickly after the battle. You know, he always personified the concept of Creole thrift. And so when he died, he was very well off. and the family continued owning what they came to call Conseil Plantation into the 1850s. And then it was sold to the Flakehouse family. And today, the site of that property is Valero Oil Refinery. And then as we move downriver, Jumonville also held on to his tract for the most part, though he had some problems. And then ultimately, he sold to Cucuria, Simon Cucuria, and then the property changed hands many times. And then of course we have Gail Buckley here tonight, who is the great lady of Pecan Grove Plantation. And of course, we're so fortunate to have Pecan Grove and to have Pecan Grove owned by Gail. And then as we go down the river, we have the Story Plantation. Story Plantation was the largest sugar plantation in St. Bernard Parish. And it was perhaps the largest sugar plantation downriver from the Orleans. It encompassed most of what is today Maryland. And there were actually 3 sections of it. And the actual house was where the oil refinery was. I can't call the name of it right now. Sinclair Oil, thank you. And you see Gail's right there to prompt me. Thank you. It's good to have cousins who put up with you like Gail. But anyway, the Sinclair tract is where the house stood. And we actually have a photograph, a newspaper photograph of the house. And it was a very classic Creole vernacular home. Looked very much like Laura Plantation, upriver if you've been there. It was raised, and nothing on the very ground floor. Everything was on the premier etage, the second floor. And the house stood there until about 1904, and then it burned. And it had been the plantation of Henry Clement Story, and then other members of the Story family lived there. Benjamin Saxon Story lived there. He had been at West Point with Robert E. Lee and with Bargyle, whom he knew well, and Grant, whom he had very little use for, and other people. And then, of course, another member of that family was Sidney Story. He was actually born there at the plantation. He later became an alderman in the city of New Orleans, and he is the person responsible for promulgating the red light district ordinance. So that's why it's sometimes called Storyville. And then, of course, another very interesting descendant of that family was none other than the mayor of the city of New Orleans from 1946 until 1962, De Lesseps Chef Morrison. So many connections that we have there. I remember well Tante Anita, Chef's mother. She was a dear friend of mine as well as a cousin. And she loved to tell me about the house. And one of the things that always fascinated her about the house, there was a seigneurie dining table, and it was round. And she said that a Lazy Susan was built in the middle of it. And it was rosewood. I've never heard of anything like it before, but I knew Tante Anita very well, and I can assure you that she would never have, she had a very clear mind and she didn't embroider things. Another thing too, her uncle lived in the house at the very last time, the end of the house, and he had married Jenny Campbell, and she was from Virginia. And Tante Anita just detested her. She said that she was an imposter because she said that she was a direct lineal descendant of George Washington. And that she was an imposter and an adventuress, and she swore that she got Uncle Clem, drunk, and burned the house to collect insurance. And then she told me that when she made her debut in the French Opera House, in the early 1900s, about 1902 or 3, that Jenny Campbell kept riding around the opera house in a carriage. So you see, there's a lot of insanity with all of this. But anyway, So as we move down the river, we come to the what became the Merritt Plantation, and that had belonged at one point to Magloire Guichard, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time of the Battle of New Orleans. And then the colonial history of the property traced to the Dupré family, Claude Dupré. And one of Claude Dupré's great-grandsons, Jacques Dupré, became governor of Louisiana as a Whig before the Civil War. And then, of course, we come down farther through what is today Violet, and then, of course, we get to Reunion Plantation. And it had been granted in the 1760s to the Le Sassier family. And the Le Sassier family had the place until 1790, and then they sold it at that point to Rodolphe Ducrot. And Rodolphe Ducrot was the son of the original Ducrot in Louisiana, and he was the first member of the family to come here to St. Bernard. And Rodolphe Ducrot and his son Pierre Rodolphe were both taken prisoner by the British in the Battle of New Orleans. And they were part of the 3rd Regiment of Louisiana Militia. And La Carrière Latour, in his history of Louisiana, records that the Ducrots told the British that there were thousands of Americans and an armada awaiting them in New Orleans if they advanced any farther, because they were both captured December 23rd, 1814. So the family has often repeated that, and La Carrière Latour cites it as historical fact. However, my great good friend Tony Fernandez doesn't believe it. But knowing the family, and since I am also a Ducrot descendant, I tend to believe it. So, and then of course we get to Poydras Plantation. Poydras Plantation was absolutely one of the most beautiful plantations in colonial Louisiana, and it was in many ways considered the gem of estates downriver from New Orleans on either side of the Mississippi River. That property had first been granted in the 1750s to Pierre Gaspard de Rochemort, who was the intendant of Louisiana. It changed hands. It became the property of Jacques Hénoux Livaudet. Then it became the property of the Marigny family. Then the Marignys had it. They sold it to Louis Brognier de Clouet, and then Poydras had it in 1817. And he was one of the truly great figures in the history of Louisiana. He came to Louisiana in the 1770s. I believe he was born in Nantes, but he had been at Saint-Domingue, where he was a rather successful merchant. Saint-Domingue today is Haiti. And there were many ties historically between Saint-Domingue and Louisiana. And there was a great deal of commerce that even the Spanish allowed during the Spanish period. So Poydras came here in the 1770s, and he made many different fortunes. He was quite the entrepreneur, whether it was dealing in silk, bringing silver, slaves, real estate, just remarkable, the things that he was able to do. Poydras was the president of the first Constitutional Convention of Louisiana in 1812. And there was a great deal of disparity and a great deal of unrest between the French-speaking people who were delegates to that convention and the Anglo-Americans who spoke English. And Poydras was one who was very much intent on preserving the civilian tradition of Louisiana, preserving the rights of the free people of color, and as much of the Côte Noire as could be preserved, and just really a fascinating figure. And then when he died, he became a great philanthropist. He endowed orphanages, he endowed educational institutions. He was really a remarkable man, in many ways very much ahead of his time. And his plantation here in St. Bernard was just remarkable. It was a colonial house. He had added to it. There was a large sugar mill, which he had rebuilt. There were other outbuildings. There was a beautiful alley of oaks along the Bayou Road. And then, of course, Bayou Terre entered the Mississippi River there at Parish Plantation. And of course, Parish also had another significance, the plantation did, because it was at the confluence of the Mississippi River and where it met the Mississippi River. Very often, levees failed there. About every 10 to 12 years, the river levee failed at Parish because 3,000 years ago, Bayou Terre, which is the ditch outside here, well, that was the main channel of the Mississippi River. And in times of flood, that bayou was a distributary of the river. So when there was a great large flood of the river, the levees were such that it just couldn't withstand that pressure, and so often the levees failed, and all of this region was flooded. And that's one of the reasons that the Parish house was built 10 feet above the ground level. It was rez-de-chaussée. There was nothing under it. So, and then of course, as we come back along Bayou Terre from Parish, there were many interesting plantations. Most of them are gone. Sevastopol still remains. That had been the plantation of Pedro Marie Arcote. And then of course we had Creedmoor, which is just down the road from here. It's still standing, as is Sevastopol. And that was the plantation of Laurent Miodon. And then going down the Bayou Terre, there was Magnolia, which was the plantation of the Jardin family and the Marrero family. And it actually belonged to Samuel Boyer Davis. And interestingly enough, Myra Clark Gaines spent her childhood in that house. And the house is still standing. It's a mud and moss between Post House, and it's owned today by the Bud Leno family, the Charles Leno family. But, and then of course we go down as Kenilworth, and there were any number of plantations. Now, let's look at what happened to the Canary Islanders, and I know I've got to wrap this up pretty quickly. But anyway, I don't have to, fine. Let's look at what happened to the Canary Islanders.
Whenever anybody gets bored, they can leave. Otherwise, some of us will stay as long as you'll talk. So.
Let's look at what happened to the Canary Islanders. After the battle, there were those Canary Islanders who stayed in possession of the land grants that they had received. For instance, this area, St. Bernard Village, is one of those areas. The Isleños were comfortable enough that they were able to come back from the devastation of the British invasion. But wherever the sugar plantations were established, sugar planters came, they purchased individual land grants which were contiguous. And in so doing, they assembled estates, plantation estates. And then they allowed the Isleños, many of them, to continue working on those plantations. And for instance, in those days, many of them became millwrights. You know, we have Janice Crespo back here. And you know, the Torreses, for instance, were well known in the lumber industry. And that all comes from working on the sugar plantations. And not only gathering sugar cane and granulating sugar cane, but also systematically harvesting the cypress that was in the areas that couldn't be cultivated. You've got to remember with these plantations, you know, sugar was the principal cash crop, but they found ways to make that land work and produce revenue the year round. So anyway, after the war between the states, the Civil War, the plantation economy of St. Bernard Parish was destroyed. And many of these Isleños who had worked on those sugar plantations and continued living on them retreated first to Delacroix Island, and then they went out to Shell Beach, and then later to Violet. And then of course Delacroix is a very interesting story there. First of all, Delacroix Island we know was granted to an Irish merchant. His name was Miguel Fisher, otherwise known as Michael Fisher. And the Irish, of course, really formed the mercantile class in many instances of colonial Spain, and they were all over colonial Spain. So anyway, he had the plantation. Then he sold it to another Irishman, Daniel Clark. And then Daniel Clark had it. And then after that, he died, Daniel Clark. And then there was a great deal of acrimony. And then suddenly a will surfaced. And Francois Jussieu de la Croix was named the executor of Clark's estate in this will. Later, Clark's putative daughter, Myra Clark, or Myra Davis, disputed all of that. So, long story short, finally Myra Davis found out that she was Myra Clark because she was reared by Samuel Boyer Davis at Magnolia and in New Orleans. And then she decided that she wanted her inheritance. So she entered into a litigation that went on for decades. It was celebrated all over the United States. And Delacroix Island was part of that litigation. Well, the family of Jussieu de la Croix, they come from the French Alps. And from the French Alps, they went to Saint-Domingue. And then from Saint-Domingue, they came here. And then, of course, in coming here, they came and then they brought with them also the other side of their family, who were free people of color. But in any event, Jussieu de la Croix Francois returned to Paris. He died in Paris. And then the Jussieu de la Croix became absentee owners of an old sugar plantation that had become fallow. And in the 1840s, the Jussieu de la Croix family had allowed a few of these Laniers, to settle and live there. But then after the Civil War, many of them had no place to live any longer, so that's where they went. And so, of course, finally in the 1890s, there was a settlement between of the Clark estate that the Jussieu de la Croix family agreed to, and Myra Clark and Jussieu de la Croix family sent the Isleños into possession formally of the land down there. And of course, the Jussieu de la Croix family had known that they were living there. And one of the very interesting things, Francois Jussieu de la Croix had a son, Daniel Hippolyte Jussieu, and he loved to fish. And every second year, he would come to Louisiana to fish. And he came in April of 1874, went to Delacroix, to the family place, the Isleños received him. And don't you know, a storm came up on Lake Leary, the ship sank, and he drowned. So from that time forward, it seems that people wanted to call it Delacroix Island. And then before the actual quitclaim from all the parties involved, placing the Isleños in possession of Delacroix, the Comtesse Jussieu de la Croix, who was a Livaudet, who was a great-granddaughter of Pierre-Philippe de Marigny, she gave land for the first school and chapel down there. So it's very interesting, that history. And then, of course, in the 1830s, the Mexican Gulf Railroad was opened, connecting the city of New Orleans and Elysian Fields Avenue to sugar plantations at Shell Beach, what would become Shell Beach. That was Proctor's plantation. And in any event, at first the Isleños resisted it, and because, you know, they had drayage service, they would use ox carts to bring the sugar and other things to New Orleans. And so they felt that the railroad would destroy them. Well, of course, the railroad did. But anyway, they actually blew up sections of the railroad So then Governor Andre Bienvenu Roman, sent the militia here. So you see, Jimmy, we've always been like we are, you know, we don't change. So in any event, after the Civil War, the Proctor family was phasing out down there. The widow Stephen R. Proctor died in the 1870s. In 1870, she had a wealth of $60,000, and her plantation was appraised at $10,000, and that was Shell Beach. So she was very well off, and you could see how impressive that plantation must have been to have had that kind of value. In the 1850s, the town of Proctorville, which became Shell Beach, was established near Fort Proctor. And then, of course, after the Civil War, Proctorville / Shell Beach became one of the great resort communities for the city of New Orleans. People would take the train down there on weekends during the late spring, summer, and this time of year. And I remember one of the persons who loved to go down there, and forgive me for digressing a bit, was Anita Olivier Morrison, Chef Morrison's mother. Tante Anita told me she loved to ride the train and to see all the cane fields and to see the beautiful houses and to see the Isleño cottages here in St. Bernard Village and Tocqueville and going down, and how they were all beautifully landscaped with roses, and it just what a wonderful place it was. And then she said there were these hotels, and we found records of them, out at Shell Beach. They were built over the lake, and she said that she learned to fish with the Robin family. And so here was someone who would later make her debut in the city of New Orleans, but she knew the Canary Islanders and fished with them. So in any event, she always told me that the best fish she ever ate in her life were the fish that she caught with the Robins that they filleted and cooked for her. So she just really loved going to Shell Beach, and so many people had great memories like that of the place. And then, of course, also it became a haven. We're going really far afield, you know, during Prohibition. But anyway, so that pretty well, I think, gives you know, a summary of how St. Bernard was, and even goes a little bit beyond, I'm sorry to say, 1865. Antonio Marrero, whose great-grandfather came here from Tenerife in the Canary Islands, and by this time owned Magnolia Plantation, was St. Bernard Parish's representative to the Convention of Secession for the state of Louisiana. And of course, there were Canary Islanders who fought in the Confederate Army, although the majority just stayed here. As you know, we fell very early to the Union in 1862, and we were very quickly occupied, and then we remained occupied through the 1870s. So anyway, that concludes my remarks. If any of you dare to have any questions, I'll try to answer. Yes.
My name is Monique Kennedy, so I have a French first name and an Irish last name, but I was born in Cuba, and my grandparents went from Santa Cruz de Tenerife to Cuba, and my mother's parents. So I grew up among Isleño culture, foods, and you know, your hams and everything else you're having there. So I say that as a way to kind of frame my understanding of the culture of this area, but I can't help but think about your conversation has been mostly about French names that own plantations, except for this Marrero you know, one that you're talking about. Even though I know that where the sugar, a process to create the sugar out of sugar cane was done actually out of two St. Bernardians, if that's the name that you have for them. But my question is, were the Isleños that came here for the most part like a working class? Or
They were called campesinos.
Okay.
and they couldn't read and write. And then, of course, one of my ancestors, also from Santa Cruz de Tenerife, was Esteban Núñez de Villavicencio. And when he died in 1828, he had a small plantation at Wood Lake. And then Roque Acosta, his father was Juan de Acosta, he was born in Fuerteventura. Roque had a plantation also in Bencheque. And then, you know, later on, there were families that had some wealth. You know, the Estopanol family, we have an Estopanol on the back there, and you're looking at another descendant here. You know, we're all inbred. The Estopanol family was never one of great wealth before the Civil War, but it was very numerous, and it was renowned for being very hardworking, and they were very highly respected. And then some of these leños, particularly the ones who stayed up here, like the Estopanols and farmed, you know, they formed a sort of middle class. They would have 2 or 3 slaves sometimes. Esteban Núñez had 20. Antonio Marrero had 35. You know, it's, you know, and so, you know, I mean, and that was a way of measuring, as you know from Cuba, a way of measuring wealth. I'm not endorsing slavery, an awful institution. But in any event, so, you know, there were isleños who did rise beyond being campesinos, but you know, in 1800, there was and one of the reasons I really didn't focus on the Spaniards that much tonight is that those of you who have had to sit through my prior lectures have had to listen to nothing but Spaniards. You know, you've heard about moleros and all that before. But in any event, in 1800, Bronya Declue blocked the road outside, the Camino Real, the Tejover Road, so that the isleños would not disturb his tranquility, going to the market with ox carts with their vegetables. And I can show you in my files a copy of the lawsuit from the Cabildo. It's 500 handwritten pages. And 3 of those pages are covered with signatures of all of our ancestors, and maybe about 4 of them could read and write. Esteban Núñez made his mark. Pedro Torres, Juan de Torres made his mark. Bartolome Molero made his mark. Diego Estupiñán made his mark. They all made their marks. They had no formal training at all. And you know, one of the reasons that the Canarios left the Canary Islands was that, one, very often the land became such that, and the population grew to such an extent that the land couldn't sustain it. And then when the Canary Islanders went to Venezuela, when they went to Cuba, when they went to other places, they actually excelled. They had an opportunity to receive education. Of course, the people who went to Cuba had some of the oldest educational institutions in the Western Hemisphere, the Universidad de La Habana. So, you know, it was very different when they left there.
Well, I will say, I've been in New Orleans since 2006, right after Katrina, and I've been coming here ever since, and I am just amazed to see what's inside your head. It's just incredible. I've been coming to listen to you talk, I mean, like, since forever, and I'm just so grateful that you have so much history and so much heritage.
Well, you're very sweet, and again, just remember, it takes 11 generations of inbreeding to get something. Yes.
Would you please tell everybody the incident you related to me about a month ago when I came here about a certain infamous Sicilian who was rescued during a storm out developed by a local rescue? I think everybody would like to hear about that.
Well, years ago, and there'll be people in this room who may remember him, years ago, we had Vito Molero, who lived in Shell Beach. And Mr. Vito was about 5 feet 2 inches tall, and he was double jointed all over his body. because he also was inbred. And he had Herculean strength. And he was quite a successful bootlegger, working with Manuel Morero, his first cousin. So he had gone in his shrimp boat to receive a quantity of liquor coming from Cuba. And it was a 30-foot sea in the Gulf in January. And so Vito was looking, and to the Isleños, they didn't care. They were going to make money, and they'd get through anything. So they went out, about 6 of the boats, and Vito was in his boat, and he saw in the distance, well, first he heard in the distance a man who spoke very good Spanish, and he was crying out, "Ayúdame, help me, help me." And so then, of course, Vito saw the man holding on to a crate of alcohol and in the 30-foot waves. And so, lo and behold, he dove in the Gulf, swam, got the man, put him on the deck of his boat, and you'll never guess who it was. Al Capone. Yeah, and they became great friends. They corresponded with each other for years. Al Capone came down here regularly, and he would always visit Vito. And as a keepsake, or as an appreciation, token of his appreciation for saving his life, he gave Vito a stick pin that I saw. It was about like this, and then it was a monkey made of yellow diamonds. And then Vito's son Tony had it, and then Vito's grandson, Tony's son, Clyde had it, and I don't know what's happened to it since then. But so that's, and you had a question back there.
I did. You were mentioning the total estate values of several of the plantations. I was wondering if that financial figure included the value of the enslaved persons on the
the Proctor plantation, that was in 1870. So that was after the Civil War. Just to give you an example, Florentin Jardin purchased the Magnolia plantation from Samuel Boyer Davis. And when he purchased it, he paid, I think, something like $150,000 in the 1830s. And I think that translates into a couple of $1 million today. And that included the enslaved people.
And sugar plantations require a tremendous amount of labor.
Yeah.
And that labor was not being done by the plantation owners or by the Isleños, really. So how many enslaved persons would have been on those sugar plantations?
Well, the population of slaves of black people in St. Bernard Parish exceeded that of the whites considerably. And I'm sorry, I don't have those figures at the tip of my tongue, but the population of enslaved blacks and free people of color was larger than the population of white people.
And I assumed that. I'm a St. Bernardian by birth, and so I've always assumed that. So what happened? Is that something that will be covered in a future lecture? Because when I grew up in St. Bernard, there were no black families around me. I didn't know of any black neighborhoods close to where I lived in Chalmette. So what happened? There was a majority black population of St. Bernard Parish. What happened?
Several things happened. One was Reconstruction. One was the nightmare of Reconstruction.
Whose nightmare?
Everyone's nightmare.
Oh, you and I gonna have to agree to disagree about that.
Everyone's nightmare, believe me.
No.
Everyone's
It was not a nightmare for black people. Reconstruction was not a nightmare for black people. I just can't let that statement stand.
Well, that can be argued, and we will agree to disagree there. I think I always say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if Reconstruction had been successful, we would not have today what we have today, which is an utter mess.